I blundered my queen. And I know, anyone who's watched my streams before, this is hardly a surprise. I Botez Gambit more than the great Alexander Botez herself. But this time was different. Because you see, usually my blunders happen in time travel, or I glance across the chat and when I look back, I just didn't notice that my opponent had attacked my queen. But this time I wasn't streaming and I had 21 hours to make my move, yet I still blundered my queen. It didn't get trapped, it wasn't a tactical combination, and it wasn't a strategic sacrifice or a mouse slip. It was just a good old-fashioned queen blunder that's characteristic of probably 600 level chess. But a picture is worth 1,000 words, so let me show you my game from the 2022 Daily Chess Champs and explain to you what I think went wrong. Perhaps if you can learn something from my mistakes, my queen will not have been blundered in vain. The game started with a Roy Lopez, and everything was pretty standard up until knight g to e7. I've rarely seen this, and to me it looked a little bit passive, although I suppose the idea is that you're going to fianchetto your bishop, and your knight on e7 is going to support a future d5 push. So I played c3, which is adding some more defenders to the d4 square and possibly supporting a d4 push in future, as well as creating a hole for my bishop to go back to if my opponent plays pawn to b5. Fast forward a couple of moves, and I get to be in quite a comfortable position, and after d5 I'm chasing the knight around. Knight to a5 looked like quite an odd looking move, although you don't have that many places to put your knight, so I just took it as a 1300 level move. I think here I probably wanted to go knight b to d2, but then I didn't see how I was going to move my knight and then get my dark squared bishop into the game, so I decided to develop my bishop first with bishop to e3, opting against bishop to g5 because I thought the move h6 could be a little bit annoying. After knight to c4, I assumed that my opponent was trying to reroute their knight to a better square, maybe here or here, because remember that knights on the rim are dim, but I also didn't really want to trade my bishop for their knight, so here I moved my bishop to g5. In retrospect, this was a pretty stupid move because any problems that I had with bishop to g5 on the previous move still exist, and after pawn to h6, my bishop either has to go all the way back to its starting square, or it has to go to e3, d2, where it's traded for the knight anyway, trade for a knight like this, or if I decide to go back, the bishop is starting to look a little bit like a French bishop if I decide not to sack over here because it's going absolutely nowhere and isn't really in the game. But oh well, maybe I was in a rush when I made this or the previous move, and also I was playing against a 1300, so chances are they might slip up sometime soon. When I saw my opponent's next move, knight takes b2, I was taken a little bit by surprise because obviously I hadn't intended to hang the pawn on b2. But the b pawn isn't always the worst pawn to hang. Often it gets an open file for the rook in the future and you can win the b pawn back, and also by going to b2, not only has the knight moved for 3 consecutive moves, while the c8 bishop, in contrast, is completely undeveloped and has no way of getting into the game, the knight is also running out of escape squares. At the moment, the only place that it's safe for it to retreat to is c4. So if I could subtly cut off the knight's escape square, then I might end up trapping the knight. I was also looking at ideas over here that let's say they go b5 at some stage in future to try and defend the c4 square for the knight. Maybe I have something like a4 taking advantage of the fact that I can take this pawn and the a pawn can't take back because the pawn is pinned to the rook. At worst I fracture their pawn structure, but maybe I can even win a pawn back if I don't succeed in trapping the knight. But of course there's one problem in this position, and that is that the knight is threatening to take my bishop on a4. And you can't sneakily trap a knight if it's traded off, but also I definitely don't want to give up my beautiful bishop for a knight that's not doing much and might be trapped. So here the best move becomes quite obvious. Bishop to b3 and you're busy cutting off the knight's escape squares, and if your opponent does something like d6 to finally get their bishop into the game, they're going to just end up losing the knight after we attack it. If you're sitting here in confusion, or if you're cotton on to what's about to happen, it'd be great if you give this video a like to help it spread to more people. You can also comment below how long it took you to notice what I missed, or you can let me know if you still haven't noticed it, and you can subscribe as a tribute to all of the queens that I've blended over the past 2 years as a content creator. So after more thought than I usually put into my daily chess games, I made my move, I clicked on the submit button because in daily chess you have to manually confirm each move, and immediately as I clicked, I glanced back at the board and saw what should have been glaringly obvious. The knight had a pretty good escape square, and that square was on d1 where my queen was currently sitting. I panicked, I probably uttered some profanities, and I scrambled to see if there was a way to cancel the move, but scarcely as I had moved my mouse the move went through, and I sat for a few minutes in utter disbelief and despair. I then tweeted about it, because then at least I got some content out of it. Shout out to Red Gryffindor who suggested this video. And I was still in the game when my opponent asked in the game chat, did a candidate master just blunder her queen? Well, I mean, technically they called me a kinda master, but at this rate it does look like my title is just a cheap knockoff of the real thing. And this now brings us to the educational portion of the video. So if you were just here to laugh at my misery, thank you for watching, and it'd be great if you left the rest of the video playing while you go make yourself a cup of tea or something, because it helps me with the watch time. So what was it exactly that went wrong? Unless queen blindness is a legitimate medical condition, and I'm not entirely convinced that it's not, I can think of a few reasons for what happened, and we'll go through them in order of what I think are the most and least common generalizable mistakes. If you think back to my narration of the game earlier in the video, there were a lot of I's. My opponent only featured when I was thinking how they could respond to my threats. While it's good to be proactive when playing chess, you can't ignore the fact that you're playing against someone who's trying their best to beat you. After your opponent's every move, you should be asking yourself, what are they trying to do with that move? If you struggle with this, an alternative way of figuring it out is to say, if my opponent had 1 or 2 free moves in this position and I didn't get to move at all, what would they do? Here, for example, if my opponent had an extra turn, they would just capture my free queen. Sometimes you'll need to stop your opponent's threats, like here where I should move my queen, and sometimes their threats can be ignored and you can carry on with your own threats and plans. But it's important to at least ask yourself the question of what they're trying to do and see if you need to stop them or not. You may have heard the saying KISS, keep it simple stupid. Often we know more advanced chess principles than our level, but we don't understand them fully and we try to implement these in incorrect situations. If I hadn't been so concerned with hanging on to my bishops, I would have avoided this entire situation. In fact, I may not have even dropped a pawn at all, because I would have spotted over here queen to e2, which is defending the b2 pawn, and the bishop so that I don't get double pawns if they decide to take on e3. This is especially easy to do with positional principles, so it's worthwhile to keep an eye out for these in your games. Do you keep avoiding bishop for knight trades and ending up getting crushed by your opponent's knights? Do you keep avoiding backwards pawns but end up having pieces infiltrate your camp because you just won't push your pawns? If you try something that you saw in a Grandmaster game, make sure that you review your game afterwards and learn if it was correct in that situation or not. It's not easy to do, but as you understand chess better, you'll know when you should apply certain rules and principles and when you should rather break them. Another problem was that I got unsettled after losing material, in this case the pawn, by surprise, and instead of being calm, I went for aggression or tricks to try get back an advantage that I felt I'd had before. It's a good rule of thumb to be calm when you've just lost material and to make the best of your bad situation. Not to go for crazy or wild variations that are either based upon hope or not grounded in solid calculation. Now, something you might have picked up on was that I kept on mentioning my opponent was rated 1300. And if I'm being completely honest, I wrote off a lot of their moves as being strange or 1300 level, and I didn't think too much about what they were actually trying to do or if any of their threats were valid. This is why it's really important to play the board and not the player, although it's easier said than done. You should never assume that your opponent's moves aren't good just because they're lower rated than you, but this also works in reverse. You shouldn't assume that a player's moves are good just because they're rated much higher than you. In online chess, I've had a lot of opponents who haven't taken free material from me because they thought it was some kind of trap. Unless you're playing against a grandmaster, and sometimes even grandmasters blunder, there's always a chance that their strange looking move is in fact a really strange and a bad move. Probably the smallest reason, but it did help me get into the position I was in, is that I don't take daily chess games very seriously and I probably rushed the opening. This game went out of theory quite quickly and I just went for natural feeling moves instead of working out what was best in the opening and what my plans were in the position. When I explained my thought process in the game earlier in the video, for a lot of the moves I was just trying to guess what I'd been thinking because I hadn't spent enough time in the game to actually remember what I was thinking in those positions. This is something that is relevant in non-correspondence games as well. I've had countless times where I haven't taken advantage of my opponent's opening mistakes or where they haven't taken my free material because we tend to just go into autopilot and play moves you're familiar with or that we usually play. While you don't want to use up all of your time in the opening, it's definitely worthwhile taking a little bit of time if your opponent switches up their move order or if they play something out of the ordinary to what you were expecting, just to make sure that there are no opportunities or threats that you're busy missing. So there we have it, my 11-move masterpiece of a game with what will probably go down as one of my worst queen blunders yet. I hope you were at least able to learn a bit, and if you'd like to continue watching some #chess content, YouTube seems to think that this video would be the best fit for you. Thank you for watching and happy chessing.